Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Nick and I would both like to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival and Northwestern Day for having us here to participate in what is clearly an amazing sharing of ideas, information, and questions and answers, which we are really looking forward to hearing from all of you at the end of our talk. So today we'll be talking about slavery on screen and some of the tensions and trajectories that organize representations thereof. There's a way that slavery on screen is really about the intersection of citizenship, race, history, and media. And if you think about it, slavery is just one of a number of sites where really the sort of ideals of Americanness, American identity, American citizenship bumps up against the reality of race in America and the reality of the way that race undermines these ideals. Other instances of this that we might think about might be the Trail of Tears and President Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. We might think of the US invasion of Mexico, or we might think about the forced internment of Japanese American citizens in the US during World War II. What's interesting about these moments is that, if you think about it, it's hard to think of moments where any of these sorts of sites get represented in media of any kind, in film, in television, so that even as we talk about sort of the paucity and the problematicness of representing slavery on screen, we at least sort of have an archive from which to draw, so that the reality of slavery as an instance that undermines, that complicates, that problematizes the idea of American citizenship is where we'll start today in our conversation with all of you. And we're organizing that conversation around about a half dozen key spectrums and dichotomies that Nick will talk about.
So let me add and reiterate all of Miriam's thanks as well. We're so grateful to be here. When we talked about planning this session, we had all kinds of different ideas about how we could do it, and really any of these spectrums, or even one side of any of these spectrums, could have organized a whole session like this. So that we could have spent the whole time in an early archive of silent cinema and early Hollywood, or with the kinds of recent films that we're imagining a lot of you may be bringing into the auditorium as reference points, like your Amistads, or Django Unchained, or Glory, or films that we hope will come up in Q&A that we won't speak a lot about in the presentation. There are film and TV representations. There are all kinds of discourses that we thought we could do. We're going to try to give you bits of each of these ways of talking about it, but some of the things I want to flag right off the bat are just how many ways of thinking about slavery's representations you could adopt. Any Golden Globe watchers out there might remember the moment a couple years ago when in their opening monologue, Amy Poehler said about 12 Years a Slave, "I am never going to think about slavery the same way again." And Tina Fey said, "How were you thinking about it to begin with?" The content of that joke was that there is one way to think about slavery and we should have been doing it. And actually, we're really interested in all the different ways in which it's important to and possible to talk about slavery. In addition to the number of ways that you could do it, we think it's actually important to think of these as spectrums along which any representation might fall. So it seems very rare in our experience that you encounter something that's put all of its stock in just realistic depiction, or all of its stock in metaphoric or figural representation. 12 Years a Slave, which is the one movie that we will both frontally address at the ends of both of our halves of the presentation, so that we do have a kind of common currency with all of you around that text, is a great example of a robustly cinematic film that's also drawing on a previous television adaptation, and of a US-funded enterprise that also has a UK director and an almost completely non-American cast, and a studio-sponsored release that's markedly coming from a kind of independent aesthetic. So any given film might fall in any number of ways along these spectra, and we want to talk with you about how that might happen. And also get away from any kind of implicit value judgment about which might be the best pole for our representation to gravitate to, so that, again, thinking about just one of them, there is such a need and a premium in our paucity, as you said, of realistic confrontations with how bad and how vast and how complex slavery actually was. But that doesn't mean that such depictions necessarily take precedence over other reasons why visual artists might be engaging other aspects of slavery indirectly or metaphorically or in dialogue with something less expected. So we'll engage the topic from all of those different perspectives and invite you to be doing the same as you listen and think about the texts that you know best.
So I'm going to begin by thinking about the distance and the difference between early representations of slavery, which is primarily on movie screens, and then more recent representations in movies and on television. We think about films from the early to classic cinema tradition, and I'm figuring this as the era roughly from about 1910 to about 1940. What we notice, especially if I go quickly to my second slide, which enumerates a lot of the films from the modern studio tradition, what we first notice is just that there are more. That numerically, there are a lot more films that either treat slavery as a novelty or deal with it as sort of a background element of a larger text. And when I say the sort of when I talk about the novelty films, I'm thinking about movies from the early 19-teens, movies like, up here I have Old Mammy's Charge or For Massa's Sake. These are generally films that are shorts. At the longest, they'd be about 30 minutes, but more often they're like about 10 or 15 minutes long. They're silence. And they are films in which the slaves that are represented are generally white actors in blackface. And so when I talk about these as a novelty, really part of the novelty is the novelty of minstrelsy, of blackface minstrelsy, and the way that minstrelsy commonly associates African Americans with humor, right? And so there's a way then that the novelty of slavery is never about a kind of reality of slavery in a particular kind of way. It's about understanding African Americans as a site of humor, as a sort of novel attraction that folk might be interested in seeing. When I talk about the second half of this list, that list that starts maybe 1929 all the way up to the 1940s, and this is in the sound era, these are films generally in which slavery acts as a sort of backdrop for the larger stories of most of these films' white protagonists. So a film like Jezebel with Bette Davis, a film like the blockbuster Gone with the Wind, a film like Carolina, these are films that are out of a tradition called the plantation romance. And these are films that are interested in the lives of white planters, of their beautiful daughters generally, and the black slaves that are in these films are not people whose lives we are particularly interested in. They are there to support the white protagonists by and large. So there's a way that, again, this sort of numerical difference is worth noting, and it's also worth noting that as we move to a more modern studio tradition, we're more likely to encounter films that put slavery at narrative center. And so part of what I want to talk about is why that is, the distinction between these two halves that I'm sort of selecting here. And part of the reason, I mean, it's sort of easy to say, well, that was the racism of the time, that was sort of the ethos of the time, and that's absolutely so. But that ethos and that racism is structured by certain kinds of schools of thought that come out of the academy as well. So the era that we might think of that mythologized the lost cause, the tragic era, all come from an intellectual historiographical school of thought called the Dunning School of History. This is a school of interpreting American slavery, the Civil War, and especially Reconstruction, that's pioneered by Columbia University historian William Archibald Dunning. He's pictured there, and his text from 1897, Essays on the Civil War and Reconstruction and Related Topics. Dunning was the dissertation advisor of about a dozen additional scholars who also wrote history in this same vein. And so characteristics of the Dunning School include a kind of empirical fact-based approach, but it's a fact-based approach predicated on the fact of African American inferiority, right? That's one of the many facts that the Dunning School draws upon in order to read and understand Reconstruction. And so the tragedy then of Reconstruction, according to this school of thought, is that Reconstruction was vengeful, that it was extreme. The tragedy was that newly emancipated African Americans were unfit to vote or to hold office, and not only were they unfit simply because they were newly emancipated, but because they were inherently inferior. So according to the Dunning School, they would never be fit to vote or hold office. And Black social and political ambition was really figured as insolence, or worse, as evidence of African Americans' men's rapacious sexual appetites. The figure of the lone Southern woman, the lone Southern white woman as their prey, is very central to the way that the Dunning School imagines and understands Reconstruction as an era. And so it's not hard to imagine then how you get a film like the 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. It's the 100th anniversary of this film this year. Exactly 100 years ago, The Birth of a Nation was released. And it's a film that absolutely conforms to the tenets of this Dunning School of History. So if we think about that as the framework, it's not hard to understand how we get a film that portrays African Americans in Congress as eating chicken, drinking liquor, putting their bare feet up on desks, that kind of chaos is emblematic of the way that the Dunning School portrayed African American political ambition in this era. It's not hard to imagine how we get a film that has not one, but two rides to the rescue by the Ku Klux Klan at the end of the film, and figures the Ku Klux Klan as the hero of its narrative. But The Birth of a Nation is also indebted to the Dunning School to the extent that it is deeply concerned with representing itself as history on screen. So D.W. Griffith, who directed this film, is at pains throughout the film to use intertitles as kind of cinematic footnotes. Again, this is a silent film, and so intertitles are often used to give us dialogue and so on. But Griffith goes a step further and quotes from other Dunning historians, including President Woodrow Wilson, and also asserts that many of the scenes we are seeing are not just coming out of his imagination, but are historical facsimiles. There are a number of slides that make these kinds of assertions. It's also not hard to see how, about 25 years later, we get a film like Gone with the Wind, right? And this is a film that is certainly a softer side of this Dunning school of thought, but it's no less influenced and informed by a Dunning view of history. In fact, the book that you see on your right side of the screen, and the gentleman above it is Claude Bowers. His book from 1929, The Tragic Era, is a history of Reconstruction that absolutely is out of the Dunning School, but it's also influenced by film, by theater, by those aesthetics. There's a way that this is a much faster paced, much more sort of crowd-pleasing kind of history. It's almost as popular a book as Gone with the Wind will become a decade later. And it's widely, widely read. And so Bauer's view of history absolutely echoes the kinds of tenets of the Dunning School that I've talked about. I want to show you just a clip from the opening sequence of Gone with the Wind that I think gets at some of these ideas, not only about the Civil War and Reconstruction, but about the way that the era of slavery was a time that's lost and that a time that should be treasured. point of its release in 1939, Gone with the Wind was probably just one of the biggest, most blockbusting examples of this kind of nostalgia for the plantation era. And so as a result, what we get in these instances are images of contented, familial, or marginal slaves. We get slaves who are absolutely happy in slavery, or we get scenes like the one that you saw with the credits rolling over slaves doing work out in the fields, herding cows or picking cotton. Or we get the familial slave. And in some ways, the familial slave is at the center of a lot of this. This is Hattie McDaniel, who played Mammy in Gone with the Wind. And the idea of Mammy is such that Mammy makes a lot of this nostalgia possible, because Mammy is, after all, in this sort of popular conception of her, more than just a slave. She's part of the family. She is family. And so Mammy does the work of obscuring the power dynamics of slavery, of the sort of oppression of slavery, and of the various kinds of abuses engendered under slavery. So if we think about the difference, again, between these pre- and post-Dunning era media representations of slavery, we can think about how in the 1910s, we have, again, William Archibald Dunning and his various acolytes, historians like Claude Bowers, like Ulrich B. Phillips, but we also have other voices that are pushing back against that notion and against those ideas. We have the NAACP, which is established in 1909, and which is a really powerful and significant voice, at the very least, in protesting the release of The Birth of a Nation, both in 1915 and its many subsequent re-releases over the course of the first half of the 20th century. We also have writers and thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, and Du Bois is certainly allied with the NAACP, but Du Bois is also important in terms of his writing of one of the first texts that we might think of as an anti-Dunningite history of Reconstruction. Du Bois's history, Black Reconstruction in America, is published in 1935, absolutely in response to Bowers' text. It is not as well received as Bowers' text for many reasons, one of which it is over 700 pages long and very specific in the way that it counters Dunning's charges. But it sort of sets up the kind of transition that takes place in the 1950s. The 1950s is really a point of change, a point where a number of things happen, both in terms of the academy and in terms of American culture more broadly, that set the stage for a different way of imagining and representing slavery. So we get inheritors to W.E.B. Du Bois's throne, like John Hope Franklin, like Kenneth Stamp, who write really important histories that complicate, undermine, and out refute and revise the way of thinking about the Civil War, about Reconstruction, that Dunning and his acolytes outline. In the 1950s, we also get the burgeoning civil rights movement, which in and of itself gives way to the Black Power movement. And in the 1950s, what's important technologically and in terms of media is that we get television. And so if we think about the way that film and television make a kind of possibility in this era and going forward, but we can also think about the difference between the way that film and television also tell the story of slavery. But it's important to think about the 50s as this sort of interesting dividing line, because in this post-50s moment, representations of slavery are undertaking a very different project than they were in the period before, because we've come to understand slavery in a very different way, in a popular and public way. And so we can think about that modern studio tradition that we talked about, but we can also think about slavery on TV and the way that a number of representations of slavery on TV from especially from the 1970s forward, begin to grapple with some different kinds of challenges in terms of what it means to represent slavery. And one of those challenges, I suggest, is the challenge of the unspeakable, the way that slavery defies explanation, is itself very elusive and incomplete and untranslatable in its very nature. When we think about a text like Gone with the Wind, we're thinking about a text that ignores or obscures or erases slave voices, slave testimonies, and slave stories. But we can also think about the challenge when we begin to tell those stories for white Americans who may feel challenged, who may feel shame, who may feel uncomfortable with this story, and with the challenge for Black Americans who may feel shame, who may feel some sense of the trauma of this era that's being represented. I think that there's a way that African American artists outside of film and television and those sorts of media have attempted to grapple with that untranslatability in really profoundly inventive, complicated ways. And I'm thinking about Cara Walker's work. And Cara Walker's 2012 art installation, The End of Uncle Tom, and the grand allegorical tableau of Little Eva in Heaven, that plays with that silhouetted iconography that we get from Gone with the Wind to represent an untranslatable, inexpressible experience of history that somehow defies language in particular kinds of ways. And there's a way that she gives us this really sort of grotesque and disturbing set of images that are both very specific and particular, down to these little small cuts that she makes of strands of hair or fingers, but at the same time that do not give us everything. We cannot see facial features. We cannot see expressions. And so there's a way that Walker's work speaks to this untranslatability of slavery. There is something that is withheld for us as viewers, even as it tells us a lot. And so I think that film and television attempt to deal with this inexpressibility, with this unspeakable character of slavery in two sort of different ways. They're not exclusive ways. I'm not saying that TV only does one and film does another, but I think that TV by its nature, because of its sort of intimacy with the audience, there's a way that TV is very invested in telling and teaching. And one of the best examples I could think of this is the 1996 Disney Channel film Nightjohn, directed by Charles Burnett. Obviously on the Disney Channel, there's a way that teaching is inherently part of what a film like this would do. But this is a film about a young slave girl named Sarni, who meets an ex-runaway who's been recaptured. His name is Nightjohn, and he teaches her how to read and write. This is a crime in slavery that's punishable by death. And so the entire film is really about her learning to read and write and the kinds of risks that both she and Nightjohn run throughout the film for this reason. And there's a way that the telling and teaching that goes on between these two characters absolutely mirrors and models the kind of telling and teaching that we get about slavery in many films on television. I think that when we can think about the sort of dominance of the miniseries format in television movies that have to do with slavery, right down to the most recent, The Book of Negroes on HBO, there's a way that the use of television's seriality, of its episodicness, and of the length of television really has to do with wanting to tell a full story, a complete story, the kind of anxiety to not omit details. And so that kind of telling and teaching is absolutely repeated on television in miniseries format. But then when I think about film, I think about the way that it makes possible a particular kind of showing and moving the audience emotionally by showing us so much. And I think 12 Years a Slave provides really amazing examples of this through its use of long takes, often close-up, as with this image of Chiwetel Ejiofor as Solomon Northup. I want to show just a quick clip from the film in which Solomon is reflecting wordlessly upon his fate after giving a letter to the Quaker carpenter Bass. Bass has promised to take this letter to his family so that Solomon may be freed. And Steve McQueen gives us this long take of Solomon reflecting on what may or may not happen. So this is just one of a number of long, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes difficult takes that Steve McQueen brings us in 12 Years a Slave. And in showing us in this way, instead of telling, he's compelling us to be there with Solomon, to see the emotional turmoil that he's going through in this moment. McQueen also gives us a similar long take when Solomon has first been kidnapped and brought to Washington, D.C., and we see him in a pit, imprisoned, his freedom stolen, and then the camera tilts up and shows us the growing city of Washington, D.C. This is a really moving juxtaposition that compels us to think about citizenship, that compels us to think about what the state of Solomon is in the capital of this newly growing America.
So if we're already hearing that there are so many reasons to desire for film and TV to tell us the facts, to tell us the truth about slavery, because even with the relatively sizable archive we have compared to some other entrenched national and global traumas, we feel like maybe that charge hasn't been taken up enough times, although we're also learning from Miriam that when you say that the thing that the artist must do is speak the truth, is tell the facts. You are prone to what that artist thinks the facts are, and that has really changed over time. And you may be boxing out a certain kind of artist who wants to tell stories about slavery, but whose mode or whose whole understanding of art is that it's not principally to communicate the way things really were. And yet, even as we say that, we also know that there can be a really dicey charge to hearing from anybody that I'll be using slavery in my film as a metaphor for, a lot of us kind of go back on our heels when we hear about what may sound like a figural appropriation of a very painful and still durable history that's with us in so many ways, but remains so unspoken. So I'm going to talk about 4 films and then end with a 5th with 12 Years a Slave, none of which aspire to tell a realistic truth exactly, but in employing metaphor or strange pressures on the image, I don't think it means that they're not telling the truth or that they're using metaphor in a pejorative sense to avoid reality, but challenging us to really think in different ways about what's at stake in this unspeakability. And I especially wanted to think about this relationship between US directors and international directors because when we hear any, again, filmmaker who's going to pick up this topic, we want to know what they're going to bring to it, how are they going to honor it, what facts will they tell. There can be a way of hearing that a non-US director is about to make a story about US slavery and think, well, this is our national past, what are they going to be doing with this? One thing that they do often is remind us that certainly in the sense of the Middle Passage and the global transport of black bodies, but also in the economic and power interests that slavery always served, this was always an international enterprise, right? So there's no reason to assume that US directors have a more automatic hold on what the problem actually was. So one interesting case study for this kind of appropriation came from Gillo Pontecorvo, an Italian director. If you know his work, you probably know The Battle of Algiers, which was his previous film in 1965. And Burn was in many ways a companion piece to The Battle of Algiers, and in a late 60s moment where all of his movies in that period are so explicitly in dialogue with post-colonial, global South, Caribbean, Marxist, student-led, civil rights, all kinds of insurrectionist movements around the globe, and willing to use the story, in this case, of a slave revolt to tell a particular story, but also tell a larger story, and in fact, 2 stories that don't always fit. obviously, about the stakes of revolution. So the plot of Burn has Marlon Brando as an 18th century English mercenary who is sent to England, recruited by some superiors in England to assist in a slave uprising in an unspecified Caribbean country, not because he is so endemically sympathetic to black self-determination, but because they realize that if we can overthrow the French Empire, the newly precarious, newly formed black regime that may take its place will need another ally, and that will be an easy bridge into having a different imperial interest. So therefore, in the second half of the movie, he is sent back to exactly the same place to topple the black regime that he helped to install in the first hour of the movie. So as the film starts, so that's the plot trajectory, but let's think about the aesthetic trajectory of the movie also, because at the beginning, we do see a relatively standard Western cinematic take on historical period recreation, costumes, sets, props, aspects of language, and the actor's carriage that may make us feel like we've been returned to a particular time and place. Although even in the case of this film, once we say that, we notice that there are shots like these where Brando's character trying to rouse or corral or reinforce the power of these black men does involve cultivating a kind of black gaze, a way of seeing such that sight and looking really are understood as part of a whole apparatus of power. That only becomes more obvious as the film goes on, and it's not just that the various revolts and counter-revolts set in, but as more black bodies enter the mise-en-scène, the film gets rougher in its look, the colors get a lot less saturated, the camera's more often handheld. There's a very different sense of Western film aesthetics giving way to a kind of style you see in a lot of guerrilla and Southern Hemispheric filmmaking around this time, in direct sympathy with these kind of political uprisings. So at the narrative level, there's no way for this particular film to end very well. The black leader is assassinated. Many of his closest intimates are jailed. There's no story possibility for an up ending. But visually, the film finds one, insofar as even these subordinated or entrapped black men are now facing directly to the camera with an unblinking gaze that they did not have as a relationship to that camera when the film starts. So as you may also see in the Battle of Algiers, a sense of mounting defiance, of authority, of a willingness not just to be looked at, but to not only just look back, but to look at this apparatus really is reinforced, even if the plot is trying to contain that. So Pontecorvo may be an example of somebody who comes into that project with some credibility built up as someone with really earnest political interests. That's quite different from the scenario of more recently Lars von Trier, who, if you know his work from Breaking the Waves or Dancer in the Dark, or his recently repellent statements about Hitler and Nazism at the Cannes Film Festival, is somebody who's a sort of born and entrenched provocateur. So of all people to pick up US slavery and decide to tell a story, you may already be feeling apprehensive about what he'll want to shock us with. And this isn't just a case of an international director. This is somebody who famously lets the world know that he's terrified to fly, and therefore has never left the continent of Europe. He doesn't even really like to leave Denmark and Sweden. So this is someone who's going to teach us something about US slavery and let us know the real facts. There are all kinds of reasons to walk into this film defiant, yourself. So, and then it only gets worse when you hear about the premise where 10 years before she beat the dinosaurs, Bryce Dallas Howard plays a criminal fugitive herself who's also crucially, and carrying over from Dogville, the previous film that this is a sequel from, although she didn't play the character in that film, is a gangster's daughter. And they are so in need of a dark place to hide from the law that they wind up in the Deep South, and particularly in a corner of the South that is so adumbrated that there is still a slave economy plantation running full force, unchallenged, in the 1930s that even the local neighbors don't know about, with slave mistress Lauren Bacall running the plantation, unwilling to let it go. She dies the very night that the gangster and Bryce Dallas Howard's character show up, motivating our protagonist to have an immediate impulse to want to overthrow this horrifyingly durable institution, only to realize that what her body really winds up doing is trying to run it better, and thinking that she can bring a more progressive politic. So that's one punchy thing that the film asserts. It also gives us the problem that for whatever specified or unspecified reason, a lot of the black people that she's meeting on Mandalay Plantation do not want the rules to change. So beyond all those narrative provocations, there's an immediate visual provocation that, like its predecessor, Dogville, Manderley has no sets. The whole film was recorded on this bare stage with the occasional, very austere indication of what a cabin or a meeting hall or a well might look like. But there's an even visual impression that we are going to push past maybe those iconographic images of slavery we're most used to seeing, the plantation house, the cotton field, even the standard images, you say standard, but the things that you're used to having to confront, the whipping scenes, the degraded clothes and the impoverishment. Instead, you see this kind of blank slate implying that there will be some kind of stripping bare of slavery to an underlying power structure, which for this film is absolutely about economic management and wealth distribution. That as the set starts to accumulate things, it is almost always cotton, or the records being kept about how much wealth is being made, or other records being kept about the physical qualities and attributes and measurements of the various black workers at Manderley. So as it starts to build up, you see that what she's come into is this very self-conscious 1930s new woman seizing an enterprise that she is now going to run and impress everyone with her politics and her expertise. This has become a way to use slavery to tell a story about capitalist management of bodies, in dialogue with so many other political platforms of its moment in 2005. Even more confrontational to us is that the film makes very clear that her fetishistic obsession with data and measurement and capitalist accumulation is in direct cahoots with her fetishizing of the black men's bodies themselves. And so you get shots like this one, this boudoir scene, where she has two equal and not even opposite objects of desire, the records of her wealth and the black man who she's been trying to get into bed from the moment that she showed up. So the sort of racist perversion of capitalism is something that this film lays bare. You can tell this is not necessarily a list of viewing recommendations, right? Like, you may or may not want to deal with Manderley, but it's quite an assertion that there's more to do on this topic than just tell the truth. And we do actually, I think, learn some things, or at least have to be in a different imaginative space in relationship to slavery to privilege the economic and the perversion of the owner, and not put all the weight on some tropes that we see more often. It's not the case that you have to go outside of the United States to see some of these challenging views. In fact, there are all kinds of oppositional gazes that are non-studio voices, non-studio aesthetics that have created quite an archive of their own. So even more timely than when we agreed to give this presentation, Julie Dash was just on Turner Classic Movies this week as a guest host, showing and commenting on a whole bunch of different African-American representations from the last 30 and 40 years that have had trouble getting distribution. Why did they ask her? Because Daughters of the Dust, and let's have a moment of horror, it took until 1991 for any movie directed by an African-American woman to be commercially released in a US cinema. And in fact, 1992, because a year after winning an award at Sundance, it still had not yet come out. So finally, Daughters of the Dust opens, and one of the problems that she faced, not only getting the film seen, but even getting the film made, was that she had dual allegiances to historical period recreation and to poetic embellishment. So she talked to financiers who she said she couldn't get any money because they simply did not understand seeing black characters in historically accurate period garb of 1900. The plot of Daughters of the Dust, to backtrack a little bit, concerns a very extended family on the Gullah Coast and Geechee Islands off of Georgia who are debating whether, and then increasingly when, to move to the mainland, where none of them have ever lived full-time. That did not grant them immunity from the slave economy. It meant that this group of people and their ancestors were often growing indigo, or crops that might thrive more on their landscape than if they had been on mainland Georgia or the Carolinas, and kind of operating as an offshore annex to a plantation economy centered elsewhere. That also means that for the Geechee and Gullah people, there was never the level of full assimilation into the religions, the wardrobes, the language traditions, the social hierarchies that you might see on the mainland. So you get a combination of period aesthetics that we know how to recognize, even if Julie Dash kept asking for money from people who said, I didn't know that black people wore these clothes. That's a direct quote. With other images from the same group of people who have religious items, totems, incantatory traditions, all kinds of object worlds that correspond to different realistic traditions. And then other figures that may look like historical recreation. So here's an indigo. Here are about 8 or 10 vats of incredibly scalding water where mostly women in a flashback to the early part of the 19th century are having to dye indigo cloth in these very heated pools of water. And right in the middle of that scene, of that happening in a remembered act by one of the characters, is this young girl in a pinafore who is not alive at that time. She's not even alive in 1900 when the story is being narrated. She is the narrator of the movie and is the unborn child of one of the characters in 1900, telling us what her life would be like if the characters in the present action of the movie make certain choices. So that's a combination of past, present, and future all happening at the same time in several images within Julie Dash's film, and several storytelling registers all at the same time. That's incredibly frequent in African storytelling, much less so in US cinema, and even less so in a US cinema that in one way is constantly telling us or implying that this is literal historical recreation, and at other times imposing poetic conceit and abstraction. So that tension applies even to some of its most literal depictions of slavery, so that you can see here in close-up how working in this incredibly scalding water with the indigo cloth is starting to stain the hands of these women indigo, such that for generations afterward, the people who live on the islands of Daughters of the Dust, even as they're rolling dice or playing games or having meals or community meetings, still have this indigo tint to their hands that stops as far down into the water as your arm would go. That's not real. Indigo didn't seep into people's skin in that way, but it's Dash's way of showing us metaphorically slavery as a stain that we don't just carry. Miriam mentioned the guilt, the shame, but we carry it sometimes on and as our bodies. One of Julie Dash's teachers in film school was another director called Haile Jarama, who, again, it's complicated to even say if this is a US film where it got a lot of its funding, but also crucial investment from Ghana, Burkina Faso, Germany, a few other places. 2 years after her film does quite well on the art house circuit, Haile Jarama puts out a film that wants to do all the things we've been talking about, explore perspective and metaphor and oppositional gaze, but also maybe shake up some of our biases of how we like to imagine others or even imagine ourselves in these earlier historical contexts. So the plot of this one involves an African-American female fashion model who has been dragooned into a fashion shoot at a slave fortress on the Ghanaian coast, where her pointedly white photographer is taking pictures of her in all these scenes and poses of, I guess, chic abandon, here on the wall of cannons facing out into the ocean. So a comment right off the bat in this film about the museumization of slavery, what it means to set up locations like this as a tourist attraction, and what it means for the West to return to Africa and the scene of slavery with a whole different set of values than recognition or commemoration or imaginative entry into what slavery actually was or what it meant, until this woman in the middle of the fashion shoot, in the blink of an eye, is suddenly transported back to antebellum America and on a plantation slave, on which she is enslaved. And it's a plantation where it becomes apparent fairly early on that there are murmurs about an insurrection, about a slave revolt, mostly driven by the men in the enslaved population, who are taking more aggressive actions toward an incipient revolt, and for that very reason are suffering some of the most flagrant acts of discipline and punishment. It'd be overstating the film to say that the women are deterring this momentum toward revolution, but there's often a sense of the women worrying more overtly that this may not be the right tactic, that maybe uprising and armed resistance is not the way to go. The film has a kind of trajectory where by the end, our protagonist will find herself, and you see how the low-angle camera here is itself even endowing her with all new levels of authority, when she finally picks up the machete and has had enough and takes the tool of sugarcane harvesting and makes it a weapon of armed resistance and is ready to join the cause. All of which is quite rousing, but there have been important African-American critics in the Academy, Cara Keeling is one that I'm thinking of, who have said, we have a really convenient habit in the contemporary frame of thinking, if I were back there, I would have done this. And it usually amounts to some kind of pushback, revolt, violent refusal, I would have figured out a way. And Keeling's feeling is that that always winds up being highly gendered, such that the position of a lot of women in these scenes to endure, to persist, to be the people who could pass on a tradition or hopefully raise a child, even if it wasn't their own child, get really disparaged in the favor of an overtly revolutionary politic. So even in that quite rare and really gutsy depiction, there is all kinds of conversation about the values, positive and negative, that may be associated with it. So I'll end too on 12 Years a Slave and say again, this is a film that has its own reasons in 2013 for wanting to tell this story. One of many, many movies that have been in development for years that finally get greenlit around 2008, 2009. Guess why? And with an external perspective of a UK director and an oppositional gaze and a different aesthetic that's not easily conflatable with Hollywood conventions, and challenging some of our biases just like Sankofa did. 12 Years a Slave got some pushback and some criticism about Solomon Northup being passive, having so many scenes like the one Miriam showed of reacting facially for a minute at a time but not doing enough. Within the film, he's challenged by some other characters, especially by women, for not saying enough or grieving enough or doing enough, and he articulates his reasons for not. But the one I'll stress as I finish is this sense of metaphor, because again, the film deservedly picked up an early reputation for finally taking an unflinching, visceral, unsparing look at, in fact, how bad this was, how vast this was, how complicated this was. But Steve McQueen, if you know his work non-cinematically, is a gallery artist whose whole apprenticeship as a visual maker has been about putting things in front of you in a gallery space and making you work out, like Kara Walker does, what is that? What story is that telling without walking you through it? So that you get, yes, a rehearsal of this true story depicted with unflinching realism, but you could just as easily define 12 Years a Slave as a feature-length oscillation between incredibly direct and markedly indirect ways of conveying the experience or the legacy of slavery, and almost wondering which is the way to go. So that on even the first shot, even some of the most realistic depictions of the plantation workforce, you have the shot framed in such a wide-angled, proscenium way that you see some of the staginess of slavery, some of the ways in which the plantation liked to perform its own power with a sort of horizontal theatricalizing, pulling out of its actors as a cast to be assessed. That rather than have a prop department that's just going to give Steve McQueen a really big set of cuffs, let's say, the first time we see Solomon entrapped, they instead give us a close-up on such an interlocking series of locks, chains, manacles, that you see in that one object how opulently oppressive and complicated and interlocking this system of oppression actually is. Or you close in on a steamship wheel that at the level of sound becomes such a churning object that you just feel slavery as a piece of crushing machinery, and you also learn a whole different kind of slave ship than that transatlantic galleon that we're used to seeing, right? The idea that Mark Twain's Mississippi River steamship can be the venue of chattel slavery recontextualizes for us. Or for my last examples, this scene, if you know the film, and I imagine many of you do, comes at the end of one of its longest uncut takes where Patsy is beaten for having gone to another plantation to ask for a bar of soap. And that's an apex in the film's commitment to realism and just refusing to let you or the camera blink. But it ends with this tilt down, and you see the bar of soap by itself, such that if you imagined walking through a gallery and suddenly coming upon that image, you might never see a piece of soap on the ground without thinking of the story that it might be telling, right? That doesn't require you to look at a brutalized body. You learn to see it in this, or to see it in this, which the first time you see this image in 12 Years a Slave, you think you're looking at a meal. And the second time you see the same image, you learn that this is a scene of ink. This is Solomon seeing what he could use to perform those acts of literacy and writing that Miriam talked about, the teaching and telling. And you have to look as Solomon is. This is his gaze onto his own plate that we're forced to occupy and imaginatively put ourselves in the space of the enslaved, seeing as them rather than just at them. And that's it.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the subtextual or kind of between the lines representations of slavery. Like I'm thinking of Spartacus and the Ten Commandments, movies that didn't necessarily depict African American slaves, but sort of used that as a way of commenting indirectly about it.
That's a good question. Am I on? Can they?
All right. Are you on?
I think so. Oh, there I am. Okay. Ah, the Ten Commandments is particularly interesting. Oh, can you hear me? Not yet? Okay. You talk then.
All right.
I can hear me.
I'll say one thing you could say about that is that those films transpire at such a decisive moment at the exact hinge you were talking about,
Yeah,
of moving
that's right.
from a sort of empirical, fact-based, and we all trust we know what the facts are version of Hollywood historicizing to a more speculative, do we even know whose experience is at the center of this? And so you do see at exactly that moment of what you're calling crisis, not just in the cinema, but in historiography and how we tell stories, that's not going to be a moment where the industry is willing to commit to negotiating that newly kind of unsettled water in relation to something as immediately politically painful as our own history of slavery. But maybe we can go back literally thousands of years and make that anodyne enough for us to work out some of our relationships to what the screen is for as television is rising up, but not the first times out of the gate with this new widescreen and this new alternative to TV with something that we're not sure we know how to handle yet.
Well, I think they also both operate on the level of spectacle, right? I mean, they're both such huge, I mean, especially with the Ten Commandments, which is one of my favorites, and it's this sort of Cecil B. DeMille extravaganza. And so the slavery gets a little stylized as a result, that there's a way that it is subject to the sort of glamour. I mean, we've talked about that film so many times, and it just sort of becomes subject to the aesthetic of prestige filmmaking in a certain kind of way. I hope that responds to the question to some extent.
Such that even as we're starting to see more of the archive of classic Hollywood and things that weren't circulating for a long time, there are films being made at the exact same time in the late 50s and early 60s where Dorothy Dandridge is on a slave ship, and they are not allowing themselves the widescreen. They're not allowing themselves a lot of those exact technological breakthroughs that things like the Ten Commandments are using. There's almost an attempt to make it look like a 40s film. When they're telling that kind of story,
right,
which may explain why we haven't seen it for a long time.
Yeah, that's right.
I was wondering if either of you could comment on what you think the future holds in terms of the telling of slavery in the United States or even beyond. Because I know you did say with 12 Years a Slave, it was 2008, and it took a while for it to actually be distributed. And I think we can all understand why. I mean, these kinds of movies are really downers, right? When people leave the theater, they're often feeling really upset. Yet, we also know that the textbook industry is trying to erase aspects of slavery. In Texas, for example, talking about workers instead of slaves. So just any comments you might have about predictions for the future.
I'm not much of a prediction maker. I mean, I think in some ways it has me thinking about that very contentious moment that you're talking about, right? Because part of what it means to represent films, for films or TV shows to represent slavery at this point is that there are all of these sort of mistakes that people have already made that now we know we have to avoid. So for instance, when we gave this talk once before, I talked about how a film like Roots is at sort of interesting pains to make white viewers comfortable, right? So we have characters inserted into the film that just aren't in the novel at all. So we have, for instance, this very conflicted slave ship driver, this slave ship captain played by Ed Asner, and we're supposed to understand that he feels very bad about the fact that he's carrying slaves, and so that's supposed to sort of shore things up. The fact that it's Ed Asner and we know him from Lou Grant, Pa Walton is in there, so that there's this way that using these sorts of familiar faces and giving us these sorts of guides through slavery, there's a way that those kinds of moves are a bit cliche at this point, so moving away from those kinds of narrative structures, it sort of behooves folk to do that. But at the same time, I think that as they try to, there's still this sort of bumping up against kind of the failure of the white Hollywood imagination, right? So we were talking before about how even in 12 Years a Slave, which is a movie that I think escapes a lot of those tropes, we still have Brad Pitt as Bass, you know, the savior. He's not there for very long, blessedly, so, you know, we don't see him riding his horse gallantly to go take this letter or anything like that. But, you know, his own casting of himself still harkens toward those sorts of gestures. So I think moving away from those gestures is paramount, but old habits die hard. You know, it's a little harder to get away from them than I think a lot of people expect.
And I think it's so interesting, you know, I just was at the Toronto Film Festival last month, and one of the things I made a point to do was to see as many of the Middle Eastern films as I could, because they never, ever, ever open or even come out on DVD, ever. And when I did that 3 years ago, they were all documentary realist explorations of what's really going on right now in Syria and in Egypt. And in just 3 years' time, as suddenly Middle Eastern filmmakers are getting to represent themselves, they haven't really wanted to tell the documentary realistic truth of the facts. They want to finally be allowed to be artists, right? And show the world formal experimentation and abstraction and poetry. I'm teaching a class that a couple people here are even good enough to be taking right now about a similar moment in the early 90s as LGBT filmmakers are suddenly able to have access to the resources to make films as and speak for. And what you see is actually more abstraction rather than more recovery. So I'm kind of wondering if more black filmmakers, and I think whenever you're a member of the group, you're under the most pressure to tell the facts. Lars von Trier and these festival-certified art cinema makers can go way out on some limb, but you're supposed to be speaking for your group about what really took place, right? As more of those filmmakers have the opportunities to get behind the camera or release the movie, I think we may actually see a lot more of this abstract, demanding figuration that they have been totally prohibited from exercising.
We have time for one more question.
Oops.
Hey, thanks for having us. It was a great event. I just wanted to ask a question about Walt Disney.
Walt Disney, did you say?
Song of the South. So you talked about, you know, information that we see on the screen being sometimes the representation of the artist who's leading the direction of the film. What do you think he was thinking there? Do you think it was his, because I've read about this, I've seen about this, do you think it was his real imagination, his art he was putting on film, or do you think there was like some subtext and some people actually helping him do something with that? Do you have any information about that? I'd be interested. You know, was there some conspiracy where Walt Disney came?
Yeah. Well, one thing you could say is, again, that the history of this archive is not that it gets more progressive over time. So you could easily find things prior to 1947 that seem less hidebound and racist than that film does. You also notice that Disney, which will commercialize and recirculate anything it possibly can, 30th anniversary version, 31st anniversary version, you know, that film still doesn't circulate. In the 40s, Disney was trying to do anything they could to experiment with sound. You get all that classical, all the Prokofiev, whatever. I think the sounds of what he wanted to hear people singing and a certain kind of sonic aesthetic actually dictated the story that he was willing to tell if we could hear Zippity Doodah from Uncle Remus. But that's conjecture.
I would hardly dare to try to get into Walt Disney's head, but I think that I don't want to be there, first of all, but putting that aside, I mean, I think that there's a way that we can think about a movie like Song of the South as sort of, the idea is that what is being done in that film is sanitized by that virtue of the fact that it's for children, right? Which is actually just the opposite. It sort of makes it 5,000 times worse. But the idea is that, you know, it's harmless, it's charming, zippity-doo-dah, you know, bluebirds on the shoulder, all of that, right? That it is somehow rendered harmless by virtue of the fact that it's addressed toward children. And I think that there's a certain appeal to children, to these sort of Brer Rabbit tales in that sense. But there's also a way that, I mean, I think what you said about the technological advances of that moment are really interesting as well. There's a really great essay by Clyde Taylor who talks about every time that we have a technological advance, we get a regression in representations of race. So we get color, we get Gone with the Wind. You know, we get sound, we get the jazz singer. You know, that every time we take 2 technological steps forward, we take 4 racial steps back.
Yeah.
And I think Song of the South is a really interesting example of that sort of paradox. That part of, and one explanation for that is that as we move forward into these technological realms, I mean, even if we think about Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is a sort of strange racial allegory of segregation and subjugation and power in its own right. So part of it has to do with sort of making these technological advances and reaching for that thing that is oddly comforting in an American context. And often that thing is a really retrogressive notion of race.
And it might be worth marking that that movie's 1947. The greatest number of people who ever bought a ticket to a movie theater in one year was in 1946, right after the war. The studios are all thinking they're serving the biggest audience that they've ever served, and that's the depiction that we wind up with. And I do think back to Rob's question and your comments about the history being in flux, that if you're not confident of the adult history that you're telling or how you would even start to do that, maybe go with the children's history, and if it looks skewed or distorted or sounds wrong, you can say, well, this is obviously not us trying to swing for the rafters here, right? This is for the 5-year-olds, even though you're quite conscious of having the biggest audience you've ever had. And that the exact black filmmakers who at that moment in the late 40s are making some of the most robust black cast musicals we ever saw, without a widescreen frame, without color, none of them are then going to get hired to make a movie in the mid-50s when all that stuff goes away. But so does Song of the South. You know, it doesn't win exactly. It's not clear what's winning by the mid-50s.